Hello, everyone. My name is John Hackathorn, and I am a Business Relations Manager here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Artificial Intelligence in Hiring and Employment. Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, John, and hello, everyone. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that is focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It includes identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a helpful learner's guide, which can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. But we do hope this information is helpful for you. Also, OOD does not endorse products, services, or vendors. However, we will share examples throughout the webinar to illustrate possible solutions and resources for reasonable accommodations. We will be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and again before we conclude to answer questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we have included in today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, John and I mention each other by name as the conversation between us goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Julie, today's webinar is focused on artificial intelligence, known as AI, and how this technology is being used in the hiring process and the workplace. What will today's webinar include?
John, many employers are striving to create diverse workplaces that are inclusive of individuals with disabilities. Many employers are also using AI as a tool when hiring candidates and managing employees with the intention of removing bias, increasing objectivity, and saving time when making decisions. And while these are great benefits, there are times AI can unintentionally cause individuals with disabilities to be treated unfairly. This conflicts with the efforts employers are making to recruit, hire, retain, and advance qualified individuals with disabilities and foster inclusive cultures. To support employers in using AI in a way that is disability inclusive, today's webinar will provide a high-level overview of what AI is and how it is being used during hiring and in employment. Now, we are not experts in creating algorithms and artificial intelligence, so this webinar will not include that type of technical guidance. Instead, we will focus on the resources employers can use to guide them in utilizing AI in an equitable and inclusive way. For example, in May of 2022, both the Department of Justice, known as the DOJ, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as the EEOC, issued technical assistance related to AI and employment. These documents inform employers of how AI can be used in ways that treat individuals with disabilities unfairly. And to prevent that from happening, the guidance addresses best practices employers can adopt to ensure their use of AI is disability inclusive. So today's webinar will address some of the risks associated with AI and include examples of how employers can avoid or overcome these.
Julie, we won't have an opportunity in this 1-hour session to address specific scenarios, but if employers would like to discuss their unique situation, we can address these one-on-one through our Worksite accessibility services. Now, our attendees today may be familiar with the term AI because there are many ways this technology can be used in our personal lives. However, I think it's helpful to define AI through the lens of the ADA related to the workplace.
John, I agree. Employers may have human resources or HR software that relies on algorithms developed through AI. These types of HR software and apps are often used by employers to screen resumes, utilize chatbots, conduct video interviews, monitor performance, and manage employees. To perform these functions, the software is programmed to follow a set of instructions known as algorithms. An algorithm is generally defined as a set of instructions that can be followed by a computer to accomplish some end. These algorithms are used by employers to evaluate, rate, and make other decisions about job applicants and employees. At times, algorithms are created using artificial intelligence. Congress defined AI in the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020 as a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. This means a software developer may rely on the computer's analysis of data to determine which criteria to use to make a decision. The Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, known as PEAT, defines AI in their AI and Disability Inclusion Toolkit as an umbrella term that refers to efforts to teach computers to perform complex tasks and behave in ways that give the appearance of human agency, which is the capacity for humans to make choices and act on these.
So in essence, Julie, these definitions mean AI technology is being used to do things that customarily requires human intelligence to do. Okay, let's talk more about the role AI plays in the workplace when it comes to making decisions.
John, according to the resources from the DOJ and EEOC, AI is being used in both the hiring process and during employment in a variety of ways. Some ways it is being used in the hiring process include scanning resumes to prioritize applications, making decisions about whether an applicant is qualified, evaluating facial expressions and speech patterns during a virtual interview, and administering tests to provide a job fit score. AI is being used in employment to make decisions about performance, conduct, advancement, and termination through monitoring or tracking factors like keystrokes and mouse clicks, usage of desktop apps and web browsing, email communications and chat messages through virtual platforms, movement about on-site and off-site work locations, and biometric information like eye movement and facial expressions. We will touch on best practices for some of these examples throughout the webinar.
Julie, with all the tasks AI can complete, it seems using this tool could be very helpful to employers. But I can see how there may be potential, although unintentional, to treat certain groups of people, including people with disabilities, unfairly.
Don, you are correct. Employers may use AI to help save time and money, make objective and consistent decisions, minimize bias, and deliver high-quality results. But if used improperly, AI can lead to treating individuals with disabilities unfairly. So, to make sure AI is being used in a disability-inclusive way, the EEOC provides guidance in 3 areas for employers to review. These areas include providing reasonable accommodations when needed to ensure the individual is being rated fairly and accurately. Making sure these decision-making tools do not unlawfully screen out individuals with disabilities, and ensuring AI is used in a way that is aligned with the guidance on disability-related questions and medical exams during the hiring process and employment.
Julie, I think it would be helpful to share some of the main points the guidance offers for each of these areas. Let's begin with sharing the best practices related to providing reasonable accommodations when AI is being used in the hiring process and at work.
John, employers with responsibilities under Title I of the ADA are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities when they are needed. A reasonable accommodation is a change in the way things are done that helps an individual to compete for a job, perform the job's essential functions, and enjoy the privileges of employment. The guidance reminds employers when they use AI and algorithmic decision-making tools for the hiring process and during employment, reasonable accommodations still need to be provided when they are needed. A best practice to support this is to inform applicants and employees of when and how AI is being used in the hiring process and at work so they know whether they need an accommodation. One way to do this is to include a reasonable accommodation statement with announcements about and invitations for the activities and events where the AI tool will be used in the hiring process and at work. This statement should be easy to find and include clear instructions along with contact information for making a request. It can also be helpful to include a description about the AI tools being used with the reasonable accommodation statement to inform candidates' employees of what to expect, like describing what skills or attributes the AI decision-making tool is designed to assess, how these are tested, and any variables or factors that could impact the rating.
Julie, you're right. Describing this information about the AI tools being used can certainly help applicants know whether they need an accommodation, and pairing this with the reasonable accommodation statement invites them to request one if they wish. Let's talk more about the ways AI is being used in hiring and employment. We can share the barriers first, and then ways we can overcome these.
John, let's start with some of the ways AI is used in the hiring process. These include screening applications and using software to ask questions, and then analyzing characteristics like facial expressions, posture, vocal tone, and word choice. The AI then converts this collection of information into a score that is automatically generated and compared with the scores of employees who are successful in the type of job the individual is competing for. AI is also being used to schedule interviews, coordinate follow-up correspondence, send information through text messages, and ask basic questions about salary and start dates. At times, AI is then used to determine whether to screen out an applicant or move them further along in the process. Again, we can see the benefits of using AI to streamline and support the hiring process, but there are risks associated with using AI that can result in treating individuals with disabilities unfairly. The Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, known as EARN, has a resource guide for employers about AI that describes 3 ways this can occur. The first involves bias in AI tools. AI tools can become biased when the data used to inform them include human decisions that were biased. The example EARN shares is when recruiters routinely overlook applications from individuals with disabilities, the data used from these recruiters will be passed on to the AI tool, which will replicate the same action. Discrimination can also occur when the data used to inform the AI tool does not fully represent all individuals. For example, the data shared with the AI tool related to appearance, speech, and other behaviors may not be fully informed to capture data on individuals whose disabilities impact these characteristics. EARN provided an example shared by individuals who are deaf, describing that AI speech recognition software often makes errors when interpreting deaf speech. AI may also lead to errors when evaluating facial expressions in video interviews with candidates who experience a loss of partial muscle movement in their face as the result of a stroke. Another example earns shares of how AI can lead to unfair treatment is when it is used to measure things like skills, aptitudes, and other factors indirectly. The example is about capturing the time it takes to complete an online assessment as a way to measure a candidate's skill level. If the test has not been made accessible, individuals who have learning disabilities or who use assistive technology to access the test may be unfairly screened out based on disability, not on their ability to do the job. Employers can use the awareness of how AI can lead to unfair treatment against individuals with disabilities to self-evaluate the current AI being used or to investigate new AI technologies being considered for purchase.
Julie, I think I want to dive a little deeper into the specific areas of the hiring process to better understand some of these barriers. Let's talk more about applications, resumes, interviews, and testing.
Sounds good, John. Some barriers related to submitting applications involve the use of chatbots. A chatbot can be programmed to automatically screen out individuals with a gap in employment, which could result in unfairly screening out a qualified candidate related to disability. A chatbot can also pose a barrier when it is inaccessible to screen reading software. Some individuals with visual disabilities use screen reading software to complete and submit applications. If the chatbot is not accessible, individuals who use screen reading software may encounter a barrier with submitting an application.
Next is resumes. How can AI pose a barrier with these?
John, AI can be used to screen out resumes. While it can be really good about making decisions based on what it's programmed to do, AI can be not so good about making a decision when the information deviates from what it knows. For example, an organization may prefer to hire candidates who have completed an internship during college. An example from Pete describes a situation where a candidate with a physical disability was automatically screened out because their resume did not include an internship. However, the individual was not able to find an internship in an environment that was physically accessible or that offered a virtual option, and so instead obtained equivalent experience through volunteering in a remote environment. The AI decision-making tool was not able to make that distinction, and so the employer missed out on a qualified candidate.
How can AI pose a barrier for conducting interviews?
John, some employers use AI to conduct preliminary interviews and make decisions. These are conducted virtually without a person overseeing the interview. What can happen is the AI decision-making tool is instructed to evaluate characteristics like facial movement and word choice, and then determine a candidate's personality and fit with the organization's culture. When these AI tools obtain data from studying people without disabilities, they aren't informed with information to accurately evaluate people with disabilities. The Pete example shares a scenario where the AI used in a virtual interview screened out an individual who is deaf because the tool could not decipher deaf speech. This resulted in a candidate being screened out without a hiring professional having a chance to meet the candidate.
Julie, it seems employers may want to ask about this feature when purchasing hiring software or reviewing what they currently use. The last step in the hiring process we wanted to talk about is testing.
John, some employers use pre-employment tests that are game-based to measure skills like empathy. The test is administered through AI, which analyzes facial expressions and then compares these with the facial expressions of people who have been determined to be ideal employees. Pete shared an example where a qualified candidate who is neurodivergent and does not express emotion in the customary way received a low score on the test. As a result, the candidate did not get selected to move on to the next step in the process. And the employer missed out on the opportunity to further evaluate this candidate's ability to be a team player through other means, like talking with the candidate's references to discuss the skills and abilities.
Julie, what ideas can you share for ways to remove these barriers and use these AI tools in an inclusive way?
John, many of the barriers we discussed have similar ways they can be overcome. First and foremost, now that employers are aware of these barriers, they know what questions to ask vendors related to accessibility when they are purchasing hiring software that includes AI, or what barriers to check for in their existing software. For the barriers employers have in their current software, one solution is to disable the features that can cause people with disabilities to be unfairly screened out. For example, turn off the feature that permits a chatbot to screen out an application based on a gap in employment if the candidate is otherwise qualified, or provide a way the candidate can explain how they are qualified for the position despite a gap in employment. Another example is to disable the feature that automatically screens out resumes based on preferred qualifications or those that can be interpreted in more than one way. Another idea is to remember to include a reasonable accommodation statement with the online application and in invitations to interviews and testing that provides instruction and contact information for making a request. It's important to post this statement where it's easy to find and in an accessible format. It's also helpful to describe how AI is being used and what AI is measuring, so a candidate is better informed to decide if they wish to make a request. And the final suggestion is to be prepared to provide a way for candidates with disabilities to participate in the hiring process in alternative ways through providing a reasonable accommodation.
Julie, that sounds like very good information for employers to keep in mind. We know many employers are using AI in their pre-employment testing and to measure employees' performance and productivity. Could we highlight some barriers and solutions specific to these scenarios in particular?
Sure, John. I'll start with an example about a pre-employment test. If an applicant informs an employer of a limitation with taking an AI-based test related to a disability or medical condition, or indicates their results for this test could be below the employer's expected levels because of one, the individual has requested a reasonable accommodation. A request can be that simple. Now, what that limitation is and what the solution to overcome the barrier is will be unique to the individual and should be determined on a case-by-case basis. However, I have some examples of reasonable accommodations that may be effective. A candidate with a disability that impacts their ability to use a mouse and keyboard may have a barrier with taking a time-based computer assessment. An effective reasonable accommodation may be to permit the candidate to provide their answers orally to a scribe to record. Or another accommodation may be to provide the test in an alternative format that is compatible with screen reading and dictation software, so the candidate can receive the written information and input their answers through these technologies. A time-based assessment may also pose a barrier to candidates whose disability impacts the amount of time it takes to process information and deliver a response. Often, an effective accommodation in this case is to provide additional time for taking the test.
Julie, and what about when employers use AI to measure employees' performance and productivity?
Let's say an employer is using an algorithm in performance testing that measures productivity based on how many keystrokes a candidate makes per minute, or an employee makes per minute. An employee with a disability that limits the ability to use a keyboard may input data into a computer using speech recognition software. This employee may be meeting the employer's productivity measures for data entry. However, the AI tool is not designed to capture information based on using speech recognition software, so the employee is not being evaluated accurately. If all employees performing the job were informed of the AI method being used to evaluate their performance and provided information on how to request an accommodation, this employee could have chosen to request to be evaluated for productivity in an alternative way that accurately assesses his or her performance. Now, in other webinars, we touch on performance and how individuals with disabilities are expected to be qualified for the job and meet the employer's productivity expectations. We also share that all employees doing the same job should be evaluated in the same way and held to the same standards. But we do explain that if an employee with a disability is performing the job in an alternative way, just as effectively using a reasonable accommodation, then how the employer measures this employee's productivity may need to be in an alternative way.
Julie, the example you shared is a perfect illustration of that. This employee can't be evaluated on productivity based on keystrokes when the method they use to do their job is to input data into the system using speech recognition software instead of a keyboard. Let's move on to the next tip from the EEOC guidance, which addresses ensuring these AI-related tools do not unlawfully screen out individuals with disabilities. How can AI technology screen out an individual with a disability?
John, first let me share that screen out means a person loses a job opportunity. An algorithmic decision-making tool can screen out a candidate or an employee from a job opportunity based on disability when, because of a disability, the individual scores too low on an assessment or below the employer's acceptable level. According to the EEOC guidance, this is unlawful when the person who has been screened out can perform the job's essential functions with a reasonable accommodation if one is legally required. I have two examples to share from the guidance that may help illustrate this. The first example is when a chatbot is used. A chatbot is software that is designed to communicate through text and email messages in lieu of an actual person. So here's what can happen. A chatbot can be programmed to reject all candidates that respond to the conversation about a significant gap in employment. Let's say the reason for a gap in employment is due to receiving treatment for a disability-related condition. The chatbot has been programmed to screen out anyone with a certain length of a gap in employment. So this individual is screened out by the AI tool because that is what the chatbot is instructed to do. Ultimately, this means the candidate's being screened out for a disability-related reason. The second example relates to the method the AI decision-making tool is using to measure a candidate's abilities. If the candidate's disability limits their participation in the method being used, this can lead to the candidate being screened out for a disability-related reason. Here's how this can happen. An employer may conduct interviews using video software that is programmed to analyze things like speech patterns and then make decisions on certain abilities, like problem-solving skills. If a candidate has a disability that limits the ability to speak, this method of testing may not accurately assess this person's problem-solving skills, which means the software could score the candidate in such a way that screens the candidate out of the hiring process. So, while AI may have its benefits, it can also come with the risk of rejecting qualified candidates with disabilities.
Julie, what can employers do to reap the benefits of using AI in the hiring process and the workplace in a way that is inclusive of candidates and employees with disabilities?
John, that's a great question, and I have some ideas. First, understand that artificial intelligence touches many aspects of employment and become familiar with the guidance available from the EEOC. This can help employers become aware of the barriers AI can present and, more importantly, identify how they can use AI in an inclusive way. Second, whether the employer is using vendor-based software or software they've created, it's important to ask some key questions about the AI tools and algorithms being used. Here are some things to ask. If a user interface is required to be used with the AI tool, was this made accessible to as many people with disabilities as possible? In what ways has the AI tool been offered in alternative formats, and has it been determined the tool does not work accurately in some cases related to disability? Was an effort made to find out whether the AI tool puts certain disability groups at a disadvantage when participating in a work-related activity using the AI tool? It may be a good idea to consult with subject matter experts when addressing these types of questions and when developing AI tools. For example, the guidance suggests when an employer is creating or using AI for assessments that test personality, cognition, or neurocognitive traits, it's best to consult with professionals who can assist with identifying ways the AI tool may treat individuals with disabilities unfairly. Employer partners are welcome to contact OOD for a worksite accessibility consultation to discuss their unique assessment goals. My next recommendation is the reminder to include a reasonable accommodation statement with notifications to candidates that inform them of when AI tools are being used. This should include a description of what the tool is measuring and how, so individuals with disabilities can request a reasonable accommodation if they need one. And the final best practice I have to share is to make sure the AI decision-making tools being used for measuring things like qualifications and abilities are directly measuring those that are necessary and essential to the job. Some AI tools infer these qualifications and abilities based on measuring characteristics that customarily correlate with them. This method of measurement can be unfair to individuals with disabilities. I have an example from the guidance about this. In this example, one essential function of the job is to create reports. The employer is aware that individuals with a certain personality type are customarily successful at creating reports. Based on this, the employer might be inclined to use a personality test to determine if a candidate will be successful at this essential function. The guidance states the employer should avoid using AI decision-making tools that infer a candidate will be successful at a task based on having a personality type similar to that of individuals who are customarily successful at performing this task. This lessens the risk of screening out a qualified candidate with a disability whose personality, because of their disability, is not like the personality of individuals who are commonly successful in this position.
Julie, the EEOC guidance offered one more area for employers to review to make sure their use of AI and algorithmic decision-making tools are disability inclusive. We've covered this in other webinars. It relates to disability-related questions and medical exams.
John, that's correct. The guidance cautions employers to make sure the algorithmic decision-making tools they use follow the restrictions from the EEOC on asking disability-related questions and administering medical examinations in the hiring process. As a review, disability-related questions and medical exams cannot be administered during the pre-offer phase of pre-employment. They can be administered in the post-offer phase after a formal offer of employment has been extended and accepted, but before employment begins. They must be required of all candidates who are extended the job offer in the same job class. Once a candidate becomes an employee, disability-related questions and medical exams can only be administered if they are job-related and consistent with business necessity. We talk about this in more detail in our inclusive hiring webinar and in the final session in the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook webinar series. A disability-related question is one that is likely to elicit information about a disability, and a medical examination seeks information about a person's physical or mental impairments or their health. So as a best practice, employers should examine the AI tools being used in the hiring process or at work to ensure they are not asking disability-related questions or administering tests that seek information about health and impairments when these are not permitted.
Julie, thank you for summarizing some of the main points from the EEOC guidance related to AI and algorithm decision-making tools. Before we move on to some additional resources and best practices to support employers, let's stop to answer some questions. I'd also like to give the employers attending today a chance to interact with us based on the examples of how AI is used in the workplace that Julie has shared so far in today's webinar. What ideas do you have for how AI can be used in a way that is inclusive of individuals with disabilities? We'd love if you would share this information by entering your answer in the Q&A box, and we'll read some of these during the break. Jolie, we have a question. How much more likely are disabled applicants than non-disabled applicants to be screened out of the hiring processes that use algorithmic decision making?
Thank you for that question, John. So that was a pre-submitted question. We had some time to think about that one. And in the information that we researched to put together the webinar today, we didn't find statistics that really answer that in a concrete way. But I think the important message here is to know that AI can be used in a way that screens out individuals with disabilities in the hiring process, and to be aware of the ways that can happen and to use the best practices that we're sharing to avoid that or to overcome that.
Okay, and we have another question. How can the applicant be assured there is no bias programmed in AI?
Thank you for that question too, John. So, this webinar is geared towards the employer perspective of this topic, and this question is about the applicant. And so what I will say is that if you are applying for a job and you have a concern about AI, I would just be aware that there can be bias and to ask questions about the process that you're entering into if the information has not been offered to you. So for example, we're sharing the best practice of for employers when you use AI to include a reasonable accommodation statement, but also describe how AI, is being used and what it's measuring. So as an applicant, if you don't have that information, just know that it's possible AI is being used for every step of the process, and maybe ask some questions along the way so that you're aware of how it's being used. And if you feel that you would like to request an accommodation, know that you have that right to do that if you are a qualified person with a disability.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your questions, and we look forward for seeing examples of ways your organization utilizes AI in a disability inclusive manner. We are going to take another break before we finish, so please post any more questions that you have in the Q&A box. Okay, Julie, let's talk now about resources and strategies available to employers who wish to both utilize the benefits of AI and foster a disability inclusive hiring process and workplace.
John, in my opinion, the #1 strategy employers can use to ensure the AI-related decision-making tools they use are disability inclusive is the same strategy we have shared in other webinars, and that is to plan for accessibility and inclusion from the start. We have discussed considering accessibility when you are planning events, starting new projects, and procuring new technology. This includes planning for the AI employers use. Accessibility is a part of everything we all do, including how we use artificial intelligence to screen applicants for a job, interview candidates through virtual interviews, and monitor job performance of employees. When employers take this step to make sure their technologies are accessible, not only are they prepared to follow their responsibilities under the ADA, they are greatly impacting their efforts to create disability inclusive workplace cultures. To support employers, we are going to discuss ideas and strategies from two well-known sources. The first is a policy brief from the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, known as EARN. This policy brief is titled Artificial Intelligence and Facilitation of Employment Opportunities for People with Disabilities. The second resource is a toolkit from the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, known as PEAT. This toolkit is titled AI and Disability Inclusion Toolkit. Both resources are included in the learner's guide that accompanies this webinar for employers who wish to review these further.
Julie, I think providing strategies from these resources will be helpful for employers because, as you said, many are working to create a disability inclusive cultures, and because accessibility does touch everything and greatly impacts inclusion, employers will want to make sure their use of AI is aligned with their inclusion goals. Let's start with the policy brief from EARN.
John, I agree. EARN's intention with this policy brief is to provide a roadmap for employers to guide their efforts in using AI in the hiring process and the workplace. The brief includes 5 sections. The first is a policy framework. The next is a helpful discussion of the barriers that can be present in recruiting and hiring. The third section addresses AI and reasonable accommodations. The fourth discusses guiding principles. Followed by that is what EARN calls best, promising, and emerging practices. And then the policy brief concludes with providing additional resources. I'm going to share some highlights from this resource.
Julie, let's start with this section on policy framework. Does this mean employers need to create another policy related to AI?
John, what EARN is referring to is the importance of employers being familiar with how the EEOC policy framework applies to AI. So AI is used in a way that fosters equal employment opportunities for qualified individuals with disabilities. The EEOC regulates and enforces Title I of the ADA, which prohibits discrimination based on disability in all aspects of employment, including recruitment, hiring, training, promotion, and enjoying the benefits of employment. When AI is being used in these aspects of employment, it's helpful for employers to remember that under the ADA, discrimination applies to the use of standards, criteria, and administrative methods that are not job-related and consistent with business necessity, and the use of qualification standards, employment tests, and selection criteria, which screen out or tend to screen out an individual with a disability or an entire class of individuals with disabilities, unless these are job-related and consistent with business necessity. Discrimination also applies to failing to select and administer employment tests in a way that is most effective to ensure that when these are administered to a candidate with a disability, the test accurately reflects the skills and abilities it is intended to measure, instead of reflecting limitations related to a disability, and applies to not providing reasonable accommodation to a qualified individual with a disability when one is needed. EARN also states employers are not permitted to contract with other entities who subject individuals with disabilities to discrimination. Ultimately meaning if employers contract with employment agents or staffing agencies who use AI and are providing services to support the employer's hiring and employment processes, employers are still responsible for these services to be provided in a way that does not discriminate against individuals with disabilities who are qualified. EARN concludes this section with a reminder that employers are prohibited from asking disability-related questions and administering medical examinations before a conditional offer of employment is made to help ensure disability is not considered before the candidate's ability to perform the job. So again, AI is being used in these aspects of hiring and employment, so it's important for employers to remember when they use AI that they are doing so in a way that does not treat individuals with disabilities unfairly.
Julie, that's a helpful reminder. We already talked about the barriers that EARN addressed in its resource for employers on AI and ways to overcome these. Let's talk now about how AI can be used as a reasonable accommodation.
Sounds good, John. Reasonable accommodations come in a variety of types, including modifying policies, providing flexible schedules, and providing equipment and services, which can include providing AI. We mentioned before that when an individual needs an accommodation, the effective solution is always determined on a case-by-case basis through the interactive process. But I'd like to share a few examples EARN offers in their resource of how AI can be used as a reasonable accommodation. Microsoft has an app that can describe people, objects, and text for individuals with visual disabilities. The app can describe color, scenes, and read handwritten text. There are speech-to-text apps that convert the spoken word into a text format that is displayed on the screen of a smart device for individuals with hearing disabilities. This can help coworkers who are hearing and coworkers who are deaf or hard of hearing to communicate with each other at work. There are tools that permit a computer to be operated by using eye control. This can be helpful for coworkers with physical disabilities that limit the ability to use a mouse and keyboard. And one last example I'll share is a pair of smart glasses that help individuals to interpret emotions and social cues. This can be useful for individuals who are neurodivergent to understand and express emotions and make eye contact with others. So AI offers additional ways employers can consider providing reasonable accommodations in the workplace.
Julie, Before we conclude the overview of EARN's policy brief, let's touch on the principles and practices shared in their resource.
John, EARN offers some guidance for employers on ways to ensure the AI tools they use work for all candidates and employees and facilitate the efforts employers are making to foster disability inclusive cultures. I'd like to share a few of the principles and practices they suggest in their policy brief. One principle discussed is that AI tools should be created using universal design, which is a design approach for buildings, products, and environments to ensure these features are accessible and usable by as many people as possible, including people with disabilities. Another principle addresses that employers should not create or procure AI tools that discriminate based on disability, for example, by screening out individuals with disabilities. And one last principle I'll share from EARN is the idea of embedding accessibility, usability, and inclusion in all aspects of the organization, including technological developments and purchases. This includes engaging with individuals with disabilities in research and development teams. To support these principles, EARN shares several practices employers can use to stay on track with utilizing AI in an effective and inclusive way. One practice is to investigate the AI being purchased or designed to ensure it doesn't screen out or tend to screen out individuals with disabilities. If an employer is working with a third party to conduct aspects of the hiring process, ensure the contract between the two parties addresses the prohibition on discrimination based on disability and, for example, requires the third party to document they are not using AI that screens out individuals with disabilities. And a final practice I'll share is when you are making planned purchases for technology, commit to buying accessible technology, including accessible AI that incorporates universal design into its products.
Julie, EARN has developed a great resource for employers to review and consider related to their organizations. Now let's share some highlights from the AI toolkit Pete offers and how this can help support employers.
John, Pete's AI toolkit is designed to support employers in using AI in an equitable way in the workplace. Their resource is organized into 3 sections called Start, Learn, and Act. The Start section provides an overview of the toolkit, which explains the content is focused on helping employers to identify how AI tools work, how they are used in the workplace, and how to overcome the challenges AI can pose. The information provided is aligned with supporting employers in their efforts to continue fostering diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible work environments. So just as we did with the EARN resource, I'll share some highlights from Pete's toolkit for employers to consider.
Julie, I'd like to add that both EARN and Pete resources are available online at no cost to employers to review. What does the Pete toolkit address in the Learn section?
John, this section addresses equitable AI in the workplace and the risks of hiring tools. It identifies what AI is, how it's being used, and what the risks are. Pete offers its definition of AI, which it defines as the use of computer systems to perform tasks that traditionally require human intelligence and senses. This means AI is not being taught by a programmer, but instead it's using machine learning or statistical techniques to analyze large amounts of data to then generate rules and predictions on its own. Some ways employers are using AI in the hiring process that are highlighted in Pete's resource include to engage candidates and support them in the application process by using chatbots to generate automated emails and text messages, to review background information by scanning resumes, to predict successful performance during video interviews by analyzing and interpreting facial movements and speech, and to screen and assess candidates for strengths and weaknesses through pre-employment tests, often using a virtual game. Pete also shares ways AI is being used to manage employees, such as to conduct performance evaluations and make recommendations on promotions, to personalize training and make recommendations on when training is needed, and to provide information on benefits through chatbots instead of a live HR associate. And as we've discussed, AI can be used in the form of reasonable accommodation, such as apps for wayfinding, apps to convert speech to text, and text processing systems that can convert complex content in a document into plain language. Once again, we are reminded of the many ways AI can be useful in the workplace, and the toolkit from Pete is another resource with ideas to address these.
Julie, it seems the key to managing AI in a disability inclusive way is to be aware of these risks and plan for avoiding them. The resources from EARN and Pete can be helpful for employers as they follow the guidelines from the EEOC about using AI in the hiring process and at work while establishing disability inclusive strategies to overcome the barriers AI presents. With that, let's take one final break to see what additional questions have come in. Julie, we have a question. Candidates that are subjected to an AI-driven personality assessment as part of the application process, what should employers consider when looking at the accessibility of this aspect of their application, especially for neurodivergent candidates?
Thank you, John. So we kind of talked about this. Sometimes it's helpful to get input from the professionals that are more informed about different disability types, characteristics, limitations that may be present. And so this is an example where employers can feel comfortable to reach out to us through a Worksite accessibility consult request so we can talk about some resources and information that may help to support that employer's unique situation. But that's the guidance I would give, is to maybe consult with the professionals who may know a little bit more about what should be included in that personality assessment.
Great. Well, thank you for your questions. And Julie has agreed to stick around for a few minutes after the presentation to answer anything that we did not have time for. But if you need to leave, no worries. This will be archived with the rest of the presentations on the employer page of OOD's website. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. Julie, what closing thoughts do you have?
John, we know the use of AI in the hiring process and at work can afford employers benefits like saving time and money while also streamlining processes. However, AI can present barriers for individuals with disabilities. While many employers are striving to hire and advance qualified individuals with disabilities and create inclusive work environments, the barriers that AI can pose work against these efforts. It's important to remember accessibility touches all aspects of employment, including the use of AI, and covered employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations for all aspects of employment, including when AI is used. I hope we've inspired employers to know what to consider when making new purchases related to AI, what questions to ask about existing AI being used, and ways to overcome any barriers that currently exist through providing reasonable accommodations. Remember, we are here to help, so if you have questions or goals related to using AI in an accessible way, please contact us. We appreciate your continued interest in our employer webinars and invite you to contact us if we can help in any way with your worksite accessibility and inclusion goals. I also want to thank our team of professionals who contribute to making these webinars a success, and to my co-host, John, it has been a pleasure to present with you today.